Welcome everyone to our webinar on the T+1 settlement transition. Really excited to have you here and explore with us this timely topic. As most of us know, since the industry announced the timeline for T+1 settlement transition last year, the industry has done significant amount of work to meet this deadline. Even though we're just shortening the settlement by 1 day, this has huge impact to the industry. With that said, now we're mid-March and the go-live date is end of May, as we know. It's a great time for us to do a check-in 6 weeks before the go-live to see where we are as an industry and also how the market is getting ready for this go-live. What are some of the challenges that's being experienced so far? And more importantly, what we can look forward to beyond this go-live. So I'm really excited that we have a panel of seasoned practitioners in the industry with me today. And I'm sure they will have wonderful insights to share, and it will be a really lively discussion. So first of all, I'm going to do a round of introduction, and I'll start with myself. My name is Jennifer Liu. I'm a partner at Capco, leading the capital markets and risk and regulatory practice. Capco, if you don't know, is a global consulting firm and dedicated to the financial services. As the name of the company implies, Capco stands for Capital Markets Company. We have large footprint in the capital market space. For example, our team has been working with the global banks in their T+1 transition from their assessment to execution. We're also deeply embedded in the Canadian market. For example, we have a team that's working right now with TMX on one of the largest post-trade initiatives. So really excited to be here. And I'm going to pass on to Barney to introduce himself.
Very much for having me on the call. Barnaby Nelson, I'm CEO of The ValueExchange. So we're a market research firm dedicated to the post-trade space. So we're very pleased to be here and obviously to be talking about an initiative that we've been working very closely, not only with yourselves, but also with CDS, with the CCMA, with IFIC, and a lot of the other Canadian institutions, as well as DTCC, to try and show a kind of statistical view on how and where we're getting ready for T1.
Thank you, Barney. Next, we have Steve.
Thanks, Jennifer. My name's Steve Everett. I head up business strategy and innovation in post-trade here at the TMX. So I look after a lot of the core and non-core initiatives, both in CDS as well as in post-trade innovations.
Perfect. Thank you, Steve. And last but not least, Jason.
Jason O'Bourne. I'm Global Head of Securities Clearance at RBC Capital Markets. So I oversee a number of operational areas across our Canadian and U.S. broker-dealers. I also sit on the CCMA T+1 steering committee as well. So I'm quite involved in T+1 on this side and have been in the industry for a number of years and have gone through the transition of T3 to T2 and various other industry initiatives.
Perfect. Thank you, everyone. And just before we dive into our discussion, just a housekeeping in terms of Q&A. We're going to have some time at the end for Q&A, but as we go along with the webinar, please feel free to put your question into the Q&A chat box, not the chat box, but the Q&A box, and we'll monitor the question as they come in, and we'll give some of the questions to the panelists as we go along as well. Okay, all right, so let's get started. The first topic I want to explore is just in terms of where the market participants are in their preparation for the T+1 go live. As we know, it's in 6 weeks, And so maybe we can have some insight into where they are and by, buy side, sell side, small players, big players. So why don't I have Barney to start?
Sorry, I was just on mute. My apologies. Yeah, no, brilliant. Thank you very much. So I think, as I said, we from a statistical perspective, I mean, I just want to share a few key points that we've kind of picked up along the way. I think the key point really is ultimately is that T+1 has been a twisting and kind of changing journey, if you like, over the last year. But the good news is, based on the research that we ran in January, that ultimately we're now in a position where I'm just going to share my screen, where essentially you pretty much were at a high state of readiness on all the three major markets that are moving to T+1. So ultimately, as you can see here, Canada just pipping the Americans by a percentage point, I think, in terms of readiness, but ultimately, and Argentina not on here. But for me, the core thing is that basically is that Q1 has been an enormous quarter of readiness and project work. So we're just emerging, I think, or just kind of. We're obviously very, very much in the home straight, as you said in the introduction. But I think it's the key point is there's a lot of work still to be done. Now, I think if you look at, as you said, Jennifer, if you break down the overall kind of global map of, if you like, of T+1, the key thing is that it does very, very much depend on who you are and where you are from an overall perspective. So you can see that basically in North America, I think it's pretty safe to say that towards the end of last year, T1 started becoming a little bit old news almost. Come on, let's stop talking about this. Let's get on with other things. But I think, for me, this correlates very, very much with the map of kind of the global impact as well, if you like. So, and I say that because it's really readiness in Europe that is probably one of the major considerations, particularly on the buy side, which we can come on to and expand on, and also in Asia. So the further away you move from North America, from the epicenter of the change, you take in a funding risk and in terms of FX, and you also take in a time zone challenge. So, for me, one of the big things is not only are we ready here in Canada, but ultimately how ready are our clients and counterparties further offshore. Now, in terms of the specific issues, I just want to touch on a few of them so that we can kind of talk through them. But it's ultimately, as we look into the run up for T1, for me, there's a number of issues that are presenting themselves before T1 and a number of issues presenting themselves after May. In the run up to May, I think the big question that's emerged on the buy side is funding. The whole question of how we'll manage funding gaps, and we can touch on this, but the sell in one market, in a T2 market, buy in a T1 market, how you manage a fund subscription where the subscription on the fund might be on a T3 basis, but the underlying buy order is on a T1, and so on and so forth. The second thing is basically essentially the big question about how automated our platforms are going to be going into May. Probably significantly less automated than we would originally have expected, but ultimately probably more efficiency driven from process automation. One of the key things that I think is becoming very clear is that ultimately is that settlements are moving into the middle office ahead of T1. So essentially, whether it be CTM, SS&C Net, or any other platform, ultimately it's really the allocation and the messaging around the allocation that's going to drive significant amounts of benefit in terms of readiness. And then last of all, FX is the big model that's basically is going to drive us. Get a lot of attention in the next 50 odd days. Now, just a couple of points I would say in terms of where the readiness is likely to leave us. Sec lending recalls, I'm sure we'll talk about. Small firms, still a concern. Are they ready? Are they not? But I think for me, the biggest concern that we can hopefully dig into is exception handling. So up to about half of all error queue exceptions, so not fails, but error queues are going to be dealt with by hand. So by phone calls and emails, which is a real challenge. And that obviously raises big questions that we need to answer in terms of how much capacity we have to address those. And then ultimately, I said, low automation rates going into May. The key question really is what happens coming out of May. Do we automate in September? Do we not bother? There's a question mark about when and how we really do move to a full trade day automated processing. So I'm just going to stop there, but hopefully, that just flushes up. It's a long answer to a short question, Jennifer, but I think, for me, the key point really is that, the readiness, we've got the people ready that we need to, barring probably the smallest firms, but ultimately there's still some proper questions I would suggest around basically manual processing and around exactly how we're going to manage funding and FX running into May.
Perfect. Thank you, Barney. Since we already touched upon the challenges, you kind of stole my thunder for the next question. But I'd really like to have Steve and Jason to chime in as well from what you've seen, especially in the Canadian market. On the broker-dealer side, on the buy side, what are some of the biggest challenges that has been experienced so far?
Well, further to what Barnaby said in regards to readiness, I would say we've concentrated for a number of months on industry testing, both in Canada and in DTC. We have a lot of industry testing going on in CDS and in DTC, so we're well into that testing period. I would say where we're at now, much of the large chunky IT developments and things of that nature have been basically deployed or are in the final stages of testing. Now, the challenge, I would say, and it's kind of highlighted in some of the slides that were just up, was the communications and dealing with or working through challenges with non-North American clients surrounding, for example, FX, affirmations, and the time zone differences. That's a real key consideration right now that's getting a lot of discussion and interaction within the industry, is to make sure that both not only are the systems are in place in order to streamline for example, FX processes and so forth, but also that counterparties and clients that reside or have their base of operations in either APAC or UK or Europe fully understand the timing implications and the very short timelines in order to execute, for example, FXs and things of that nature. So that's definitely getting much more focus now in those type of discussions. Now that a lot of the industry testing, we've made our way through it. There's still more to do, and there's a lot of internal testing that firms are continuing to do. But now it's focused not only internally but also on our counterparties, because we're all in this together. So whether firms have all their ducks in a row internally, you're reliant on your counterparties to be ready as well. So that's a big focus as well right now.
Yeah, I think Jason's spot on there, and maybe just to bring those two comments together, what we saw on the slides of what Jason was saying. Certainly, what we're seeing at a CDS perspective is testing is going really well. The interaction with counterparts is also really good right now. I think the big challenge that we would specifically see is the unknown that T+1 brings. I think one of the interesting stats is around time to recover when we do find something going wrong. It went down from 19 hours to 5 in a T+1 environment. So what Jason was talking about there was really important. It's connecting those counterparties and the ecosystem in a way that when we test, we're actually taking into account what we would do on an exception basis. So Barney's point earlier that there's been less automation. There is going to be a higher reliance on these new processes that have been put in place. And that's really going to get tested when you put the ecosystem together. In the happy day testing scenario, this is all good. But if something goes wrong in that chain, whether it be FX, whether it be a securities lending recall, failure or anything along those lines, you could see like a cascading, automatic type effect across the chain. And I think that's where T+1 is a little bit different from maybe other contractions in the settlement cycle, where you had this effectively T+5 original design, which had been squeezed as much as it possibly could. At the beginning of T+1, I know there was a lot of the tagline going around that T+1 is really T+0 slowed down for T+1. So that's what we would have done if we had 3 years to prepare for it. But we didn't have 3 years. And given the short amount of time, the tactical solutions, putting in new processes makes so much sense. And then automate as far as you can, test with the ecosystem, and then really those elements get really tested when something goes wrong, in terms of how good those processes are.
Yeah, I would just add to that whole point about resiliency. Completely agree, and that's where participants, if they have not already done so, need to take a look at. We have much smaller time frames to recover from outages, or if particular process flows go down during the day, when we're in a real time, and we have much less time to recover. So that whole resiliency on how are you going to replay the transactions, or how are you going to capture all the messages that have been dropped in order to feed into your reconciliations and so forth, is a key consideration that sometimes doesn't receive the attention that it needs to, especially when we're coming into T+1, right? Like, you're going to be sending in, whether it's allocations or real-time trading, and if an OMS system goes down for 15 minutes, you're talking about thousands of transactions that need to be managed and handled before the end of the day, because settlements are going to start happening in the overnight, and you've got to be able to deal with that, where in today's world, we had a day to sort through a lot of that. Yeah, we're no longer going to have that opportunity in a T+1 environment. So that's definitely key. I agree.
If I may, I mean, I think, one of the points that I think, Keith at the CCMA has been very clear on is everything we're talking about also assumes a certain amount of industry capacity. That that there, for every phone call, there's got to be somebody picking up the phone and somebody answering the phone, and so it's the big challenge is that all of the manual processing we're talking about has a natural limitation based on the amount of capacity that we have in the industry. If we click past that for any reason, and that the error queues just grow to the point where actually we've got more phone calls and emails than to be sent or received than we have in the industry, then we start getting fails. I mean, it's not meaning to be kind of doomsday, but I think for me there is a risk of us clicking over into a world where our demand outstrips supply.
Well, with that said, I'm a bit curious to hear, especially from Jason, as a broker dealer yourself, how is this T+1 change impacting your operations in terms of its operating models, process, challenges? Are you having internal solutions to address them?
Yeah, for T+1, there's been a significant focus on IT development and system deployment, and much more so than we saw from the move from T3 to T2, because in that move back in 2017, we were still able to rely on batch processing. Overnight processing, we were still able to reconcile our street side activity on the morning of T+1 and so forth, where now with this shift to T1, a lot of our focus has been to migrate away from batch-based activities that occur on the morning at T1 and move that all into real time on trade date. because if we look at both in the Canadian marketplace, we need to have our institutional trades matched by the morning of T+1, 3:59 a.m. is the new time frame for T+1 in Canada. But also in the US, with the new rule coming around, 15C6-2, which mandates that institutional trades get matched on trade date, which is effectively 9 p.m. in the US. So in order to have all of that activity, all your allocations booked, reconciled, and affirmed on trade date or by these matching timeframes, you've really got to deploy real-time reconciliations and streamline that whole flow trade life cycle. On top of what we've been looking at for real-time deployments, I would say another area that firms need to look at is just the streamlining of account opening, the whole account opening process, and shortening the length of time it takes to, for example, open sub-accounts or just onboard a client. That historically has been measured in hours in today's world, and that really needs to be shortened down into minutes, put it that way. Along with that is the whole SSI, standing settlement instructions, and streamlining that process and ensuring, because obviously you're not going to be able to match your trades on trade date if you've got the wrong settlement instructions on the account. So if that is currently handled in a manual nature, or it takes a number of days to update settlement instructions, that's definitely a focus, that an area that firms need to look at to ensure that that is automated. It's automatically updates your books and records, so that, if a client goes in or a counterparty goes in and updates their settlement instructions at 9 a.m. this morning and then allocates trades at 4 o'clock, you've got the updated instructions, right? So that's a key point of area of focus as well.
Yeah, perfect.
So those are some of the key areas. Obviously, there's the FX piece. There's also stock loan and the recall processes that need to start occurring on trade date. So there's a lot of different activities there. Many of them are focused on moving into that real-time environment, getting a real-time view, real-time reconciliations, things of that nature.
Thank you, Jason.
And actually, if I may, I think Jason's point on the account opening is so critical, because everyone gravitates naturally towards settlements and funding the trade, but ultimately, if there's no account to trade on, then basically it's pretty moot. But I think for me, one of the things that, talking of changing behaviors, obviously a lot of brokers are still basically only open the sub account when the trade comes through. So ultimately, this whole idea that, that's to your point, Jason, that's almost not really practical anymore. The idea that basically that you'll suck down the SSI as well as the account information as you need to trade, realistically, that's just not viable anymore. And so there's some pretty well accepted standardized behaviors across the industry on account opening that we're going to need to change to get ahead of this stuff.
Yeah, completely agree.
Listen to your point about, really, even though we're talking about T+1, we're ultimately gearing towards the real-time settlement, which is the eventuality. So the firms should have that long-term view, which we're going to talk about some of the future opportunities to avoid any kerfuffles. So, all right. So next, this is one of my favorite topic and question. Just given, we only have 6 weeks left, from your point of view, what should the market participants focus on right now so they can go live? Some of the things, I think, Jason, you already touched upon some of the counterparties, the communications. What else that the participants should think about?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Pending that they've already done all of their required testing, especially for their internal deployments and all. Obviously, there's still a testing window here for industry testing. So if you're that's first and foremost. Make sure any of your deployments, any of your industry testing testing with counterparties. Okay, well, a lot of firms are focused on, well, I can set up all my trades and all that in CDS or DTC, and all my systems work. Again, it's take the opportunity to engage some of your bigger or clients that have unique flows or counterparties that take this opportunity to test. But as we get closer, like I was saying before, it is focusing and taking a look at, obviously, the process flows for some of the counterparties that are outside North America, as well as focusing or looking at metrics, matching rates, and having those discussions with counterparties and clients, because we know we've got to be, for NI21, we've got to be at that 90% at 3:59 a.m. for matching trades, 15C6-2, 90% by 9 p.m. on trade date, right? So now if firms have not already started capturing some of those metrics and having those discussions with counterparties in regards to challenges that they're seeing about those matching rates, now's the time to have those, because it may drive further changes or further change in process or IT changes as well. So that's definitely a key. Is we're getting close, obviously, to go live date, and it's just now is the time to really monitor, get a better feel for where focus and which particular transactions are having challenges and need a bit more attention.
I think, if I may, I think one of the things that for me stands out in terms of the preparation for May is also this idea. Anecdotally, there's more and more evidence of people taking a kind of low risk model into May, which is basically strip out pretty much everything that it's going to create risk. So you pre-fund your FX. If you have an FX exposure, you step out of lending. You kind of try to dial down, but your exposure to some of the more kind of problematic counterparties, various things, that basically are going to create risk, as I said, ahead of May 27, 28. I think for me the big concern about that, particularly on the fund management side, is that every one of those steps reduces risk. It also reduces performance, and so I think there's a real challenge going into the transition of people needing to take a low risk approach, which is entirely right. But actually, we've got to be very, very cognizant of the fact that there's a risk that a performance drag that we're creating in stepping out of yield enhancing activities, and that therefore that model can only last for so long. Which comes back to the original point that we've all been saying in terms of automation, that you can only survive on a low risk interim model so long as it's interim, but otherwise it becomes a long-term performance problem for the industry.
Yeah, absolutely. On the whole fund. Go ahead, Steve.
Yeah, sorry about that. I think that the stats are telling that as well, right, Bonnie? Is that around a third of the industry projects, around 33%, are only going to complete after the T+1 goes in. So that tells us that quite a few firms have a commitment to the automation process, which is great. And as long as it stays interim, just backing up that view 100%, I think that's really the key. I think the elephant in the room is that if you haven't started automation, you're probably not going to get it in 6 weeks. And certainly, potentially the tactical interim solution there is going to be, really focusing on processes for the next 6 weeks, making sure that they're bedded down, they're tested, escalation procedures are in place, and coverage. So obviously, what T+1 does do, one of the key implications, it pushes the day later. So our settlement timelines effectively can't, stay the same, but the amount of processing and the effectively what we'll be fixing or checking or sorting out will be a little bit later. So that ability to quote unquote follow the sun is going to be really important towards the end of every day, every settlement day.
Completely agree, Steve. Especially the extension of office hours or business hours within your operational areas or mid-office areas in order to process those allocations, do the reconciliations. And obviously, firms are looking at locating some of those individuals possibly in taking advantage of Western time zones, okay, where, for example, in Vancouver or so forth, that you'd be able to leverage an extra 3 hours at the end of the day in order to support some of that, or you have individuals within your current location working later. But I completely agree. It is pushing a lot of those activities that were taking place in the morning of T+1. Now they're taking place in the evening of trade date, right? And how's that going to work? And ensuring you've got the capacity and the resources to be able to do that is definitely key.
Yeah. Sounds great. Also, given that I think at this point we expect, Barney, to your point earlier, there will be exception handling, there will be failed trades, there potentially could be outages day one or day two after the go live. What are the firms should think about just to cope with those situations?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good point. I mean, ultimately, preparing for fails is preparing to fail or something like that. But I don't know. I mean, I think for me, the big question is ultimately it goes back to Jason. I think if you're only discovering about counterparties triggering fails, internal processes triggering fails on May the 28th, then obviously you've got a bit of a challenge in terms of your own competence. I think we do have enough time to be able to kind of get ahead of it. And if anyone's relying on a big flat doodle on the 28th, then ultimately it's just not going to work. So, in terms of what to do, people are going to have to provision for more active fails coverage borrowing. People are going to have to provision for kind of, more balance sheet, more cash available on account, all that kind of stuff. But at the end of the day, for me, I don't think any of that stands up versus just actually knowing that your counterparties are actually and knowing concretely that you've tested with your counterparties to know that they're going to be okay.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Right. Okay.
Agreed. And further to that, in regards to, I guess, readiness, like if you look at CDS publishes the institutional trade matching stats for Canada, and I think the February ones were putting the current matching rate on trade date at about 48% on trade date. So obviously there's room for improvement there. That number's got to be up at the 90% by 3:59 a.m. So that's where, that whole engagement with counterparties and understanding, just the whole timing. When are the broker or when are the sell side setting up the trades? Okay, what time frame does the buy side or the custodians come in to do those affirmations or confirmations in CDS, and just that coordination, right? Yeah. Because it obviously the stats as of February, say we've still got room to improve those numbers. Put it that way.
And I think, for me, that's a great point, that ultimately this isn't one of the points that we often hear is, well, where do I look? Where do I look to test? Where do I look for the information? The truth is, as you say, Jason, it's readily available in our own firms. Yeah. It's very, very simple. Who's in your error queue today? And basically what work are you doing on the morning of T+1? And ultimately that's the work that needs to disappear. So I think it's, from a testing and a planning perspective, it's very transparent actually to look at the error queue, to look at the work that's going on the T1. As you said, what is that 60%? And actually and really breaking into that. So I think for me, the key is that it's not actually a question of I don't know. It's actually much more a question of just getting on with it.
No, agreed. And to your point about error queues and so forth, that firms are processing exceptions on the morning of T1. Be mindful that in the new T+1 world, any of the corrections that would be processed on settlement date, like now you've got all these knock-on effects as far as your settlements areas have to be able to capture that real-time activity. Your stock loan area has to have a view into it because whether or not they need to borrow it. So there's lots of knock-on effects by having to do corrections, which will now be on settlement date. You've got to take into consideration the impact all those corrections have on your funding and all of those implications. And that's where, as much as possible, you want to address those type of issues or exceptions on trade date, so that you come into the morning or on settlement date, you go into settlement date in as clean as possible from a securities or a reconciliation and trade booking perspective.
Well, now we talked enough about what people need to think about for the go live. I want to move down to talk about looking beyond May 27th. What are some of the things that participants should still address post go live? I think we already talked about, at this point, people really need to de-risk. They need to put a lot of manual process in place, make sure they have the coverage just to meet the go live date. But after go live, what are some of the things now they have time to address?
I would say some of the areas that I'm expecting or that will gain more focus will be, for example, there's the potential for increased fails in the short term after T+1 as counterparties and firms sort through the processes of funding and sourcing securities and relocating their securities to the right depositories and so forth. So it'll be exception handling will be the focus, I would say, or at least one area focused after we go live. We'll be managing whether it's fails or managing those exceptions, streamlining that and implementing workflows, for example, to get off of as much as possible sending out emails. We all get hundreds of emails a day, and that's something that I think there needs to be more focus, and those collaborative tools, both internally and externally, right? In order to, for example, communicate recalls in a more automated or streamlined manner. And also communicate within various different areas within the firm, outside of email, but more in a workflow manner. So I think that'll be key as well. Again, is that focus on metrics, dashboard reporting, client and counterparty communication on how everybody's doing. Okay, how are we doing as far as the various different NI 24/1 matching rule and 15C6, and identifying where there's challenges and having those discussions and just having the tools to make that readily available to both the front office and mid office teams that need that on a timely manner, right? So that there's not a lot of time and effort putting in to create those type of metrics. It's more on an on-demand basis. And I think that'll be an area of focus as well, if firms don't already have that in place.
Yeah, I agree, Jason. And then, putting my market infrastructure hat on, a lot of these things are common, right? It's, broker dealers, custodians, buy side, sell side will have these as common issues. And I think one of the things we see from our position in the industry is that when we have to wait for everyone to make these changes, we could wait a long time. And because the ecosystem always is ticking along, there can be unintended consequences of those that are slower, or you can be as good as you can be, but if your counterparts aren't matching in time, your counterparts aren't really fulfilling the obligations, it's really going to start affecting even those that have done really the good preparation and have post-go live automation plans. So certainly from a market infrastructure perspective, that's the perspective we're looking at as well, is how can we do a lot of common platforms, products, enhancements to what we're doing, whether it be post T+1, we have PTM coming, which is going to be a great enhancement to our core product offering from a settlement perspective. The T+1 Recalls Hub is another really good example, something that's really non-competitive in the industry, but is, to Jason's point, taking emails away. Because if we have to wait for an email chain, what we don't realize is the amount of people it has to go through and hands it has to touch. It has such a severe knock-on effect that I think that we need to look at solutions a lot more like that, which will allow capital, time, and energy internally at firms to actually focus on the competitive differences. So I think certainly that's our role that we're looking at from a market infrastructure perspective. Is how can we get that common processing standard really high, and get the escalations as low as possible, and let the firms do what they should be doing.
Yeah, I mean, I think if I may add as well, I think, if you continue the chain of where we're kind of going, I think to your point, Jason, you've got to be able to, you can't manage what you can't measure. And I think, as you say, Steve, there's a lot of areas that we've got to be keeping a very close eye on from an industry perspective to be able to remove them from the kind of collective, overhead. I think for me, the one area I really, really cite, though, is not to harp on, is this hidden performance drag, that I think from an investor's perspective, there are, one of the biggest, most complicated things is going to be managing and measuring the cost of the funding gap, this additional day of funding gap in a higher interest rate environment. That's going to cost us all inevitably. So tracking that, the risk is that we bungle it, because ultimately the treasury guy will just sit there and say, I don't know why, but my treasury costs have shot up since May the 28th. And I don't really understand why, but I'm paying out, I'm using a lot more credit facilities from my banks than I ever used to. So I think one is to Jason's point, measuring, but very, very much measuring, not just from an ops perspective, from a treasury perspective as well. And I think to carry on that point, there's the FX, how much pre-funding you do drags on the portfolio. And then also how many trades, particularly in the US, how many trades move into the night cycle, settle gross versus, versus rebooking trades, extending settlements versus actual fails. All of those come at a balance sheet cost. And so I think for me, it's absolutely critical that we keep a good eye on what the business case is to drive all of this automation, not just operationally, but also from a treasury perspective.
No, completely agree, especially on the funding and the FX piece. Like, there's various different options, and there's a cost, there's pros and cons to each of them. For example, pre-funding, like you said, the performance drag and the additional costs associated with it, or depending on the time zone of where the clients base their operations out of, or are they going to execute their FX on trade date for T+1 settlement? Well, you got a very small window there. Like, if you're doing market on close at 4 p.m. in the Eastern time zones, then you've got basically 2 hours to get those transactions into CLS for T+1 settlement. If you don't choose that approach, then you're doing FX for same day settlement, and there's implications there. It'll be outside of CNS. You've got that bilateral settlement and more settlement risk associated with that because it's outside of CLS. So there's a number of items to consider there, all which have pros and cons, and are really driven by, do clients or counterparties or so forth want to pre-fund it? Do they have a base of operations in North America, or are they strictly based out of non-North American jurisdictions and so forth? So it's a complex topic that the funding and FX item has been discussed from day one, and is ongoing as everybody and all various different industry participants work through the various different challenges there.
That's a great point. And also, as Steve just mentioned, this is really an industry effort because we're all in this together. If if all fail, there's really no winner in this game. So either we have to all go or we can't go. So
No, absolutely. And to that point, like, even if, like I was saying before, a participant they've got all their testing, they're perfect. If their counterparties aren't there, then there's challenges. But even the way the markets are so interconnected, like even if you look at between Canada and the US and dual listed securities and so forth, well, there may be fails on the street side within CDS where counterparties or participants are expecting to receive in order to make deliveries to and it's just a knock-on effect. So if one large participant isn't ready or there's a particular flow issue, then yeah, it will just have a knock-on effect and slow down the settlement processing of those transactions across both Canada and the US.
Great. Okay, so we're coming to our last question of today. So now we talked about the things that participants should address, and just to make sure we don't have fails and exceptions. But what about can business leverage this T+1 transition as a business opportunity and make changes to their current models and systems and leverage solutions, as we just talked about, for example, the recall hub. So I'd like to have some inputs from all of you as well. I see a lot of nods.
I would say leveraging the T+1 opportunity. Well, obviously, if you haven't taken I guess the advantage of all the development related to T+1, like a lot of that would need to have been planned for last year, for example. But there's definitely a lot of opportunity to streamline processes, obviously, from an automation and exception handling. But like I was saying before about the account opening, SSIs, like that is a key piece that T+1 has pushed the industry that needs to be addressed. Same with allocations and that whole process flows that in today's world, yeah, some firms may have still been processing allocations in a manual nature, sending in emailed allocations or PDFs or Excels. And this T+1 has really pushed the need to get that completely automated, whether it's via CTM or SS&CNet or fix messaging. That has really driven that forward to get those type of allocations and a number of those processes in a more automated manner. The benefit as well, not only of the automation and eliminating the manual intensive work that is driven from some of those exception handling processes, is also once it's automated and you have digitized a lot of the information associated with those transactions, the next step is you are able to measure it. You are able to get the metrics because it's in an automated work stream. Now you can start measuring how many cancel and amends do you have, at what time during the day, when are various allocations coming in from various different jurisdictions, where that may have been a very manually intensive exercise to try to measure that before. So that's definitely one knock-on benefit of automating a lot of these processes, is that now it's much easier to measure it. And have the dashboards and the real-time views into a lot of this information, which will further allow you to streamline the processes. So that's definitely one benefit I would say that isn't a direct focus of automation is the whole dashboard and monitoring and metrics piece.
I think as well, for me, that if you think about you take all of that and you actually put it into a P&L. For me, that we're not doing T1 to survive it. We're doing T1 because it's going to leave us slightly better off than when we went in. And I think for me, you know, the as you said, yeah, I think the data visibility piece is so critical, but also just the simple fact, if we can get a task done in seconds as opposed to taking hours, then that's basically going to rip, you know, billions of dollars out of the P&L of the industry in terms of cost. So I think for me, you know, at the end of the day, somebody said in one of the working groups that, you know, that T1 is basically making up for 20 years of poor capex in the back office. I think, you know, there's a strong element that actually, if we can get to any level of decent automation and data visibility, that is going to rip out huge amounts of unnecessary phone calls and emails across the industry that basically carry a cost to them today. So it's very easy for us to dwell on the downside risk of T1 in terms of the costs, the performance drag, et cetera. But if obviously the onus is on us as, generally speaking, profit-making organizations to say, well, okay, you know, this has got to leave us $1 better off than it's cost us. Otherwise, basically, it's you know, obviously it's a loss maker.
And actually can completely agree. But and then there's all the other standard or the initial T+1 benefits that obviously we've all looked at in regards to reduced volatility exposure because there's one less day from a counterparty or settlement risk perspective, reduction in collateral at the clearinghouses and things of that nature. So there are definitely those type of benefits. I was more some of the more ancillary benefits that you wouldn't necessarily jump out at you, like Absolutely. The metrics or things of that nature. Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, and on that point on collateral, I think we're seeing the number at around 30%, 31% reduction as far as CDS collateral goes, which is pretty substantial. And then you know, the part that people don't like to talk about just yet because they're like, let's get over T+1 before we talk about this. But it's you know, settlement cycles are not going to get any longer post T+1. And that's the reality, whether we like to talk about T+0 or not, and how that'll happen. That's you know, this is the pit stop towards when that happens. The when we shouldn't be in the business of prediction with crystal balls. But you know, one thing's for sure is that the initial driver to getting T+1 in, which was regulation coming out of the US, a lot of that original regulation actually focused on T+0, and T+1 was the compromise given industry consultation. So I think that all of these things we need to take a strategic lens to. So the stuff Jason's mentioned are, you know, in my mind, very good strategic views because the dashboards and everything you're going to be reusing in shorter settlement cycles. I think where we may need to start, you know, thinking a little bit differently is T+1 is the end of the T+5 structure. It's the T+5 structure that was put in many years ago, and T+1 is the last stop on that train. And when you move to a T0 market, it means a fundamental shift and change in the way you process. Continuous batch processing really becomes what you're doing, and effectively, and I say this in a very layman way, but you're clearing out your risk throughout the day in a very final way, and really that is where we need to get to as an industry. It's ultimately when we should never lose sight of this, who we're doing this for, the issuers and the investors, and ultimately when we can take it down to that level, we completely take out, you know, the settlement component of risk as much as we possibly can, and I think that that's really exciting as the next step to look forward to.
Great, really excited. You know, the T+1 does bring some benefits to the business, not just a regulatory requirement. On the other hand, we have actually a few questions in the Q&A. I know we only have 5 minutes left, but see if we can address these questions really quickly. The first question is about how are the regulatory bodies adapting their oversight and supervision frameworks to accommodate the transition to T+1?
So I can comment a bit on there's been changes to NI 24-101 that will be going live for T+1, and that's the institutional trade matching. I can't really necessarily comment on how each of the various different regulators, both in Canada and the US, are adapting internally or anything like that. I can speak a bit to the regs. So for NI 24-101, we spoke that it's moving obviously to 3:59 a.m. on T+1. So that's a key change. There's also been a notice related to mutual funds 81-102, which has basically said that they're not mandating all the mutual funds in Canada to move to T1. They are going to leave it up to the individual funds to make that decision. So there's obviously a number of changes, both from a regulatory perspective, taking place. As far as the direct oversight or additional reporting that's going to be put in place, like if we look at NI 24-101, in today's world, there was, if you didn't meet the particular matching rates on a quarterly basis, you would have to file reporting. That is no longer going to be, my understanding is, required once T+1 goes live, but firms are still obviously have to have policies and procedures in place to ensure that they're meeting those matching rates. In the US for 15C6-2, there's similar requirements for matching at 90%. The firms also have to have either policies and procedures or agreements with their counterparties to meet those matching timeframes, as well as data retention, timestamp information, and so forth. So there's definitely a number of things to consider from a reg perspective there.
Perfect. Thank you, Jason. I know we also have a few other questions from the Q&A, but we are at time. So I will reach out to the panelists and we will provide some of this response after the session, because I do want to make sure we can wrap up the session and be on time. So I just really want to thank you, all our panelists again here today. Just a lot of great insights. As we are moving towards end of May, if there's still any concerns, questions that you will have in terms of your implementation of the T+1, please feel free to reach out to us. And we're here to answer your questions and provide our insights. And again, thank you for the panelists. And I wish everybody have a great day.